to make these neurotransmitters and hormones. So if your diet consists of, Tim Hortons for breakfast, McDonald's for lunch, and A&W for dinner, that's not going to be supportive, and you are going to feel not very good. So food does affect how your brain functions. This pathway in the body, the tryptophan pathway, is important and was one of the main pathways that Dr. Hoffer was supporting in me when he started me on the supplements that he did start me on. So we want to recognize that there are certain nutrients that are essential, which means that you cannot make them. You have to get them from your diet. And it's not just enough to eat a tryptophan-forming food. You still have to have enough B6, magnesium, vitamin C, zinc, to make the conversion all the way to serotonin. Most antidepressants work at that serotonin point in the pathway, which is 3 steps down. So we want to start at the very beginning of the pathway. So I know diet is a big area for people, and it can be overwhelming when you first go to see a naturopathic doctor. I can tell you the first time I saw a naturopathic doctor, I had to cut out wheat, dairy, sugar, eggs, tomatoes, and chocolate. And I'm thinking, well, what's left? I didn't know what to eat. I hadn't heard of quinoa, didn't even know how to say it, let alone spell it back then. So I try to encourage people to just make a few key changes. And so one of them is I ask them to make sure they're eating a tryptophan-forming food. I didn't mention this, but I was also a vegetarian for a period of time when my mood was not good during that time. And that's because I was deficient in tryptophan and B12 and iron. And all of these nutrients are important for you. So tryptophan is an amino acid, so it's got to come from protein. There are some vegetarian sources. However, it's difficult to get the amount that you need just from eating avocado and cashews. We also want to encourage foods that are high in B6, because B6 is involved in the conversion of tryptophan to 5-HTP. We also want to ensure that you're getting the essential fatty acids. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are certain nutrients that are essential. This means that you cannot live without them. And what's this up here? What's this big blob up here? It's a big blob of fat. You need essential fats to support your brain. And Dr. Hoffer, he wanted, there's 2 omega-3s, EPA and DHA. And he was, at that time, was focused on making sure that the ratio of EPA to DHA was in a 3-to-1 ratio. And I find when I work with patients, if they are a 10 out of 10 depressed, then I will put them on a 3-to-1 ratio of EPA to DHA. But if they're, as they get better, then we can step that down. And we always want to be also mindful of and supportive of one of the organs of detoxification, which is the liver. Your liver works hard for you, and you need to support it. And one of the ways is by ensuring that you're eating the vegetables that support liver function, such as beets and carrots, dandelion greens. Now, in terms of foods to avoid, this is a long list, and I won't go through every point. What I'll emphasize here is a few things that if you're doing them, I would really encourage you to wean yourself off of them. The first one is aspartame and artificial sweeteners. So a lot of people are starting their morning with coffee, and then they're having Diet Coke for lunch, and then maybe another coffee in the afternoon, and perhaps another Diet Coke, and then wine and beer at nighttime. But I want you to know that if we were to melt or boil us all down, 70% is water. That's what we're made of. And so if you're not drinking any water, you're not going to feel very good. You're going to have headaches, you're going to be constipated, you're not going to sleep as well. So you got to remember, if you don't put the right gas in the tank, the car is not going to run. And so that's really important. So if you are drinking pop or diet pop, I would really encourage you to try to switch that out to water and wean yourself off. In terms of sugar is the other big culprit. I find that many of us are addicted to sugar, and it's a socially acceptable compound for us all. But there was a study that was done on rats, and they gave them 3 doors to go down: sugar, heroin, or cocaine. And they all chose sugar. So the more that you can do to wean yourself off of sugar, your body will thank you for it. And then the last one here is wheat. For many people with depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder, wheat is considered, they have food allergies to wheat. And you can see a naturopathic doctor and get yourself tested for food allergies to see if this may be a problem for you. It was for me. So I just put this slide up because it can be complicated with respect to food. And so there's Jesus, he's holding a loaf of bread and a fish, and one person says, well, I can't eat that, I'm vegan. And the other person says, well, has that fish been tested for mercury? And the other person's asking if that bread is gluten-free. So if you want a place to start with respect to diet, I would suggest that you try to just shop around the perimeter of the store, that you increase your water intake, look at incorporating tryptophan-forming foods into your diet, and start there if you're looking for a starting point. In terms of the supplements, I won't go into the specific doses because everyone's an individual and everyone does not need the same nutritional requirements. What I might need may not be the same as what you might need. So, and it's important to understand that some of the nutrients like B3 or niacin needs to be monitored because it can elevate liver enzymes. And so if you already have elevated liver enzymes, you don't want to start on niacin. And I find that when patients come into my office and they bring in bottles and bottles of supplements, I find in general that there's 3 things that people are doing wrong with supplements. They're either taking the wrong form of a nutrient, they're taking the wrong dose, or there's non-medicinal ingredients that are not beneficial. So the main nutrients, and I've touched on this, but the main nutrients to support that serotonin pathway to help with depression and anxiety is niacin and niacinamide, vitamin B6 in the form of pyridoxal 5-phosphate, and folic acid in the form of 5-methyltetrahydrofolate, and B12 in the form of methylcobalamin. So again, you want to recognize that there's different forms of nutrients, and some are better than others. And then there's zinc, vitamin C, and magnesium that are also important to support mental health. There's also many botanical remedies, homeopathic medicines. I'm not going into all of that information today. So I talked about the foundation of health being diet, sleep, exercise, and managing stress. So in terms of sleep, this is really, really important, not just for somebody with mental health challenges, but for all of us. 100 years ago, before electricity, people got on average 9 hours sleep a night. And now it's 6 hours. And I see that getting worse, actually, with the iPhones and iPads and everybody staying up, updating their status on all their social media outlets. And it's really important to recognize that sleep is a foundational building block to your health. So you really want to treat it like a precious commodity and get as much of it as you can in terms of, you know, that 7 to 9 hour range for yourself. What's the optimum amount that you need? And I cannot emphasize this enough for bipolar disorder. It is really important to make sure that that patients are sleeping, or if you have bipolar disorder, that you sleep. I know for myself that lack of sleep is something that has been a trigger for manic episodes. And so for myself, it's a really important piece to the puzzle to make sure that I am getting the sleep that I need. There's a inverse relationship between cortisol, which is a hormone produced by your adrenal glands, and melatonin, which is the sleep hormone. And if your cortisol is elevated at nighttime, it's going to inhibit your melatonin, and you won't sleep as well. So that's why it's important to have a very good sleep hygiene where you do things that are calming and relaxing before bed. You know, you're not playing violent video games and you're not watching, I don't know, The Axe Murderer or Take 10. You're doing things that are calming for you before bed. And each hour of sleep that you get before midnight, it has been said that it's worth more than an hour. I think there's a new Charlie Brown movie coming out, so I thought I would put this out. So a good laugh and a long sleep are the two best cures. So in terms of exercise, this is really important for depression and anxiety. Your brain produces certain endorphins that help to elevate your mood. And I know for myself, I can tell you that there have been times when I have been so depressed that the only thing that I accomplished in a day was getting from my bed to the door, out the door, in nature for a walk or a run. And sometimes that time frame from bed to the door was 8 hours. But I can tell you this, I never once have come back feeling worse than I went out. And as hard as that was, and as difficult as it was, and for many days and months on end, it wasn't that it was the cure, that it snapped me out of my depression, but it did help. And if you can enlist somebody to help you get out, there's so many benefits to exercise. I just want to make sure, though, that, as I mentioned earlier, that you're not using exercise as a compensatory mechanism for hiding something deeper within yourself. So my preference is for you to get out in nature. You get exposed to vitamin D when you're outside. And there's been research on this showing that actually exercising in nature helps elevate serotonin levels. So in terms of, we've talked about diet, sleep, exercise, so then the next foundational area is looking at stress. How's everybody doing for time? Am I doing okay for time? Yeah. So the biggest area, I think, from a stress perspective is being able to recognize what your triggers are. And Dr. Hoffer had talked about an adrenochrome hypothesis, which I think is interesting, and I wonder about that with bipolar disorder and the connection with mania. Because adrenaline or cortisol gets released, and in some people, they can't break it down. And so there's an intermediary byproduct called adrenochrome, which it's like essentially it floods your system. And I know for myself, when there's been times of mania, there has been a lot of stress going on in my life. So when I'm working with patients, I talk to them about their thoughts and teach them how to manage their thoughts. Because I think our thoughts contribute a lot to the stress that we're feeling. So we want to recognize that each of us has, well, I guess I'll speak for myself. I have a voice in my head that goes on and on. And you may have a voice in your head, a little man or a little woman that keeps talking and talking and talking. And you're completely identified with that voice. But what I want you to understand is this voice in the head is not one that you have to believe every single thought that you have. And the breakthrough happens when you can recognize that you may have these thoughts going through your head, but there's a separation between you and this voice. So in Buddhism, they say that Zen is very simple. You don't rely on thought anymore. So Zen is very simple. You don't rely on thought anymore. So the way that I teach patients to not rely on their thoughts is, first of all, you've got to recognize. You've got to recognize that your thoughts trigger an emotion, which trigger a thought, which trigger an emotion, which trigger another thought, and that just goes round and round and round. And you stay stuck often in depression and anxiety and obsessive thoughts. So you have to break that cycle. And one of the ways to break that cycle is through mindfulness, is through using the breath. So you have to first recognize, okay, here I am thinking that I suck and that I should leave the stage and get off the stage. So these are thoughts that are going on. And you may have thoughts that are going on in your head. So then you have to refrain from following these thoughts around and around. And you do that by relaxing into the breath. So most people are living up here in their heads, and most people are just breathing with the top little bits of their lungs. But you want to recognize that your lungs go all the way down to here, and your diaphragm comes across. And when your diaphragm pulls down properly to take a full inhalation, sitting right underneath your diaphragm are your adrenal glands. So physiologically, you're wired to calm yourself down through the breath. So the next step is to resolve that you have to repeat this process. And I can tell you, when I was first taught this, that I said, well, I'm going to be doing this all day long because I'm so stuck in depression and anxiety. And my teacher said, so be it. That's okay. I encourage people to rephrase whatever the problematic thought was that they recognized. So I gave the example of I suck. Then the rephrase is, you know what? I'm not so bad. Or I'm pretty good. And the last one is to reward yourself. To be kind to yourself. Going back to that piece of compassion. I also teach patients about the 4 agreements. And I find, is everyone familiar with the 4 agreements? Yeah? Yeah, it's really really important, especially the don't take things personally and don't make assumptions. If you find yourself ruminating in your head about certain things, ask yourself if you've taken something personally or if you've made an assumption. And chances are you may have. And I do want to make a comment about positive thinking. I'd be really, really wealthy if I had $1 for every time somebody said to me, well, just snap out of it. Just think positive. That's your problem. You just don't know how to think positive. And this quote is from Anita Moorjani in her book called Dying to Be Me. She says that sweeping statements such as negative thoughts attract negativity in life aren't necessarily true and can make people who are going through a challenging time feel even worse. Using this idea indiscriminately often makes people going through tough times feel as though they are bad for attracting such events, and that's just not true. So on the contrary, it actually has less to do with our thoughts than with our emotions, especially what we feel about ourselves. It's also not the case that attracting positive things is simply about keeping upbeat. I can't say this strongly enough, but our feelings about ourselves are actually the most important barometer for determining the condition of our lives. So in other words, being true and loving yourself is more important than just trying to stay positive. So I'll finish with a poem that I wrote. This poem I wrote when I actually was riding my bike home after I heard about Robin Williams, who committed suicide in summer of 2004. And as I mentioned, again, I'm really happy to see that we're talking about mental health and that there's been a shift, over the last 20 or 30 years of, keeping things in the closet and not I felt like I couldn't be open about who I was and what I've gone through. But I really think that this conversation needs to move from talking about it to what are we going to do about it? What's the action steps? Because by 2030, one person is going to, globally, will commit suicide every 20 seconds. So to me, this is a silent epidemic that's going on. And we all have a role and a responsibility to reach out to those that we know, that you may know, that are suffering. So the poem is open, see, feel, believe, change. So open your mind, open your eyes, open your heart to the belief that change can happen. See with your mind, see with your eyes, see with your heart the change happening. Feel with your mind, feel with your eyes, feel with your heart the change in belief. Open, see, feel, believe, change. Thank you.